Hi there. I'm Linda Pilkey-Jarvis with the Washington State Department of Ecology. I manage the oil spill preparedness work for the spills program. In Washington, the largest of companies that move and store oil have to write oil spill contingency plans. So I'm going to use the word plan holder when I walk through this presentation to mean those companies. In 2019, we completed a rulemaking that updated the requirements for oiled wildlife response. And I'd like to talk to you about some of those innovations in this short presentation. We spent a little bit more than a year working with a diverse group of people from Washington and beyond to update our rules. So this was in response to a change in Washington law that directed Ecology to start regulating those organizations that provide wildlife response services. So we wanted to make sure that the wildlife response that happens in Washington is conducted in the most safe and effective manner. It's fully integrated into ICS, that our response resources, and that means both people and equipment, are available in a timely manner, and that we use the best practices for assessment, capture, and care of oiled wildlife. Previously, our rule for many years focused primarily and maybe even solely on the idea that birds could be impacted by an oil spill. It required equipment to respond to an oiled wildlife kind of an incident. It didn't speak to the people that were needed to respond. So that was some of the starting place that we had. The oil spill planning regulations apply in Washington in both the marine and the inland environment. So that's the whole jurisdiction area that we regulate. And so this slide just sort of speaks to some of the variety of species that we're planning for under these new regulations. This is why it matters. In the incident command system, we would use the wildlife branch to organize our efforts. The main goal of the wildlife branch is assessment of an incident, collection and rehabilitation of oiled animals. And we hope to use the response protocols that are recognized worldwide as the best practices. So these have been improved for 30 years over responses that have occurred all over the nation and the world. Oil spill response in the Northwest is governed by a regional plan that includes Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. So this wildlife branch is what we propose under that regional plan. This is a picture of the organization that we propose. So here in the Northwest, the branch is responsible for both the planning and the implementation of a wildlife response. So in that sense, it's kind of like SCAT, that the planning and the implementation both occur in the same unit or branch. In this branch, we expect to see agencies like U.S. Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, it's Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the state agency, contractors, including those that have permits to perform this work, and the responsible party for a large spill. We would also maybe use volunteer citizens to help with this work. One of the foundations of the updated rule requires that plan holders have a contract with a wildlife response service provider. So that's a term that we coined during the rulemaking. They must use, and in their oil spill plan, show that they have access to a provider who's been approved by the state of Washington. And then we go on to say that we'll use drills to verify that access. So wildlife response service providers apply to Ecology, and in their application, they describe to us their people that they have access to, their response times, and we can break that down in a number of ways. People that are permanent, people that are on standby, people who are in a sort of a volunteer status until they're called up. So we want to know who they have access to, where their home base is, and what their travel time to Washington would be. So the fantastic gain that we have by this rule update is that these organizations will have sustaining support for the work that they do. And in that sense, we can guarantee that there's a rapid and aggressive response to incidents in Washington. Our rule also talks about the facilities that are required to have a response. The new rule increases the footprint that we had previously or that we have currently. And the plan holder has to show that they have access to this equipment through a contract. And that's usually done with well, what in the federal parlance is OSRO, but in Washington, we call them PRCs. So they're the ones who own the equipment primarily. In the original rule, we stated the need to have access to this facility, but then outside of the rule process, we actually designed it. So that actual capability was never described in the rule. And that was, a glaring gap that needed to be filled. So now we do describe what this equipment means. There's more on this topic here in a minute. And then last of all, the new rule requires that plan holders show in their plans detailed narrative that describes how they will conduct a wildlife response, including through all phases. So let's break that down a little bit. An early priority would be acquiring real-time information on the species, the location, the number of animals that are in the response area. So what is it that you actually are dealing with? In a theoretical way, we know because we keep data about resources that are at risk. But one of the first steps would be to actually get out into the field and sort of take an assessment. We'd be looking at where they're feeding, where they're nesting, what their daily movements are. And so we would want to have a broad overview, and that helps us prioritize the next steps. Maybe we need to do some deterrence or some recovery efforts. But the plan holder in our rulemaking has to show that they have access by air, by land, or by water. So their plan needs to tell us who's going to do it and how it gets done. In a lot of responses, there may be opportunities to prevent wildlife from being oiled. So you might do that by deterring or pushing them away from the oiled areas, or even preemptively capturing to physically move. And that really just depends on the kind of species that we're talking about. So that's always a better alternative than having to recover and rehabilitate oiled wildlife. So that would be the step that you take after your assessment. And we need the kinds of experts who understand the habits of species and what the success rates have been from incidents all over the world when you take these kinds of actions. And those are our agencies and our wildlife response service providers. One of the new improvements in our rule is the ability for field stabilization. So previously our rule didn't even speak to this, and we didn't describe the resources that were needed. So what this is it's supporting field work to assess the health of wildlife, and stabilize them. These are oiled wildlife before you transport them to a rehabilitation facility. So our rule requires that this stabilization trailer, that's how it is described, is capable of arriving at a spill site within 12 hours of spill notification. So that language to assign a timing value to something is called a planning standard. And that presents something that's measurable that plan holders need to achieve. Another phase, unfortunately, if you can't prevent the oiling, is the rehabilitation. So this is a slide that we've used for a while now, and it describes a typical layout of the facilities that we have here in the Northwest to manage oiled wildlife. So you can see that there's a whole bunch of different functions here, but some of the more important work that occurs is documenting the oil impacts and the physical condition for each individual animal from the start. So we also have to make sure that they're again in stable condition before you even begin the efforts to clean the oil. When you are done cleaning, your goal is to restore the condition of the wildlife or the animals so that they can improve their chances of being when they are released, of being successfully released. And so that also involves evaluating their fitness for release. So I should mention here again, just to be clear, that most of the equipment that we have and that we require is owned by a response contractor, the OSRO. But it's the wildlife response providers, the wildlife contractors that I talked about earlier, who will come in and manage and operate these facilities. Okay, so our rule, and this is the phase that we're currently in right now to increase our ability to respond to an oil that could impact whales, and specifically southern resident killer whales here in Washington. So southern resident killer whales are endangered. They're listed as endangered under both state and federal regulations. So our new rule requires the plan holder to demonstrate their ability to conduct reconnaissance for whales and monitoring of whales. And this is typically done outside of the oiled area, because the whole idea here is to find them before they migrate into the oiled waters and turn them away or keep them away. So NOAA has defined that as 20 to 30 miles outside of the immediate spill area or the trajectory of where we think that the oil will go. So we need the right people to do this work, because you have to have the ability, for example, to identify the type of whale. And so this requires a lot of coordination, specific equipment. We anticipate that this will also be done by air and by boat. So that's a lot of resources that we want the plan holder to describe. But whales don't avoid oil spills. We don't have plans to, catch them and rehabilitate them. So keeping them away from oil is our only option. So here's a list of different components to a whale deterrence program. And I guess the bottom line is that we need to have the right agencies that have the right knowledge, authorities. We need to make sure that authority is passed down to the unified command in the instant command system. We need to, have the right stimulus that can be used that will bother them but not harm them. And so, we are hoping to build a cadre of vessels of opportunity, or VOO, to help us with this work. And the idea is that the plan holders will show how they have access to those vessels of opportunity. So thank you for taking time to listen to this presentation. I cannot wait to see where we are with our regional capabilities 5 years from now. So I'm incredibly grateful for the investments that plan holders are making and for the expertise and the best practices that our new wildlife response service providers are bringing to bear in Washington. So these are very smart and targeted improvements to our regional plan and capability. Thank you.